This is the Wandering Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to the Wandering Mike. Today, I'm here with Sarah. Hey, Sarah, how you doing? Of
Hi, thanks for having me.
course. Looking forward to this. This is going to be very interesting for me. Um, yeah, it's going to be a nice conversation. To to get us started, if you just want to introduce yourself to the people, tell us a little bit about your life, your journey, anything you want to share.
Sure. So, my name is Sarah Seltzer, like seltzer water, and I am talking to you actually from my office in Midtown Manhattan, New York City, where I was I was born in New York. I lived in New York my whole life except for the college years, and I am just a diehard New Yorker. And Manhattan, all in Manhattan, not even Brooklyn. I am a writer and editor and a mom of two boys who are 5 and 8. And right, I have always been a huge and passionate fan of all pop culture, right? So we're talking movies, books, television, television shows,
Mm.
literature, and music. And um, I fulfilled a lifelong dream this past year by publishing my first novel, which is um, a fictional story about a family of musicians. It's called The Singer Sisters, and it was a dream come true because I love reading novels probably more than anything else, except for listening to music, which is my other favorite thing to do. So to write a book that combined fiction and music was just an incredibly fun thing to do. And it was a 7-year project from start to publication day. It's a very big deal when it finally came out. And now I'm, just enjoying life being a published author and taking care of my family and, continuing to edit other writers and help them achieve their dreams as well.
Very cool. So there's a lot of things that I find interesting in that. And obviously, we're going to get to the novel because I love reading and I also love listening to music. So I really want to get into how that transition for you was from consuming to actually creating. But before we talk about all that, um, what I personally also find super interesting is the city of New York. I feel like for a lot of Europeans, or at least for me personally, but a lot of people I talk to, it's sort of a dream, live in New York one day. It has that flair. For someone growing up in Manhattan, as you said, can you take us through that? What is the vibe of the city? What is the driving force? Like how is it growing up in Manhattan?
I really loved growing up in Manhattan, and I think my kids like growing up in Manhattan too. We have to ask them, but they seem to like it. It is, the one big advantage that both they have and I had is that we live near different parts of Central Park. So, Central Park is
Mm.
huge. It takes 6 miles. It's like a 35, 40-minute bike ride to go around the whole park. It's gigantic. And so even if you live within a 10-minute walk, you have the advantage of being able to play outside. There are playgrounds, ball fields. There's even right where I live now in Harlem, we're very near the part of the park called the North Woods, where there's a river, a waterfall, trees. You look around, you don't
Yeah.
even know you're in Manhattan. So when people ask me what it's like to live there, I say that, probably one of the things that people don't know about New Yorkers is that we love to get outside. And sometimes I think New Yorkers take more advantage of that. I think this is true of big cities around the world. I've been to, like the Vondel Park in Amsterdam and various parks in London and Paris have the same vibe of people just understanding that this small, however many square miles patch of green is like what they've got. And so they have to use it. Um, so a big part of my childhood was the park, was playing baseball and soccer and just climbing the rock. Central Park was blasted out of bedrock. So there's a ton of huge rocks, giant rock formations in the park that kids love to climb. Another big part of growing up in New York is the museums. And that's probably what people think about first when they think about visiting the city, right? Is like going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Natural History Museum to see the dinosaurs. And where I grew up on the Upper West Side, both of those museums were within walking distance of my apartment. So spent so much time in those places that they feel very comfortable to me now when I take my children there. It's like, um, I can sort of navigate my way through by both museums by instinct, and they're huge museums. And they're, beautiful spaces. So, being surrounded by art, and there's tons of other small museums in the city. Obviously, there's the Guggenheim and MoMA, which is not very small, and lots of little gems, art galleries. So you are exposed to culture really intensely. And every
Right.
kid in the city does go to museums with, even if they're not going with their families, they're going with school a lot. So that's just a really wonderful and special thing. And then the third thing that I think is wonderful about being a kid or just living in Manhattan is just the cultural diversity. So kids go to public schools and they have friends who celebrate every holiday you can imagine from many different countries around the
Yeah.
world, the families. And it's, and everyone kind of knows and respects each other's calendars here in a really interesting, great way where it's like the city has suspends parking rules for so many different religious holidays. For Diwali and Yom Kippur and the beginning and end of Ramadan and Christmas and Easter, and that's just sort of the beginning. So it's true. There is, of course, there's plenty of inequality here. There's a lot of poverty the way there is around the whole world right now, homelessness. There's a lot of problems here for sure. And, you can't sugarcoat that. And that was true. I grew up in the 80s, which was another era when the city had a lot of problems. But the other side of it is just feeling like you're really in the center of the world and the sort of level of respect that people have for difference here is pretty cool. So that's all I've ever known. And I do sometimes wish that I had spent some time living somewhere else for the just for the experience. Spent more time living somewhere else, but I also know that I would have ended up here no matter what. So, because where my family is and where the world of journalism, to the extent that it still exists, is centered here.
Right.
So I would have ended up here anyway, and and so it's home. It's home, and it's really unique. Except people when I've traveled to other countries and I remember once I was, like, camping in the French Pyrenees, like, in a giant tent,
Oh, nice.
like a youth camp, like, I was by myself, and I met this girl who was my age, but I was about 20, I think, or 19, who came from Paris, and the way she talked about Paris, living in Paris, reminded me of how it feels to be a New Yorker, that she just, like, missed that things were open all night. That kind of like the things that you take for
Me,
granted living in a huge city where she's like, "Oh, everything closes so early here and, you can't take the subway." So I
me.
think, it's yeah, I mean, it's just big city life, really.
So, one thing that you mentioned is the thing about journalism. I didn't really have that in my head. Is that a big advantage you think as well for writers to be based in New York? Is that kind of a hotspot for journalism?
It is. So, most of the industry is here. The big magazine and the New York Times, obviously, and a few other
Right.
papers and magazines. So to the extent that there is a center of journalism, it is here. The literary world, the publishing houses are all here too. Um, so
Mm,
there's, I think, advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is you can meet people. There's a lot of networking here. There are a lot of events here you can just walk into and like conferences. Um, there's so much going on all the time. So it is central. There's a disadvantage too because there are so many writers in New York. It's harder to stand out.
right.
And I know friends who I know someone who published a book this year who's from um, who are even like a smaller city like Nashville, Tennessee, where the whole Nashville community came out to support her book because she was a local author, and there's no such thing as a local
Mm,
author like that in New York. Everyone's a local author. There's like hundreds and
yeah,
hundreds publishing books here every year. Um, so it's both an advantage and a disadvantage, I think. But in terms of working in the media, working at a magazine or a newspaper, a lot of it is centered here still.
right. Yeah, it's always um so I'm originally from Germany, and the example I just thought about was because for us it's basically Berlin is
Yep.
where people go to do stand-up comedy, for example. And so it is always interesting to see that these hotspots, or however you want to call it, centers form in specific cities, and how that basically creates a community and people just like connecting and everyone moving out there for that sole purpose. And basically, yeah, just how these things form in different cities. So New York would be that for publishing and journalism, pretty
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, you have, and obviously we have the whole entertainment industry is out in LA here. It was a little bit in
Yeah.
New York, but mostly in LA. And then, you have tech in places like in the Bay Area. So it's not everything centered in New York, but New
Right.
York is interesting because there's a bunch of different industries. So it's like advertising and media and finance is
Mm.
here and fashion is here. So and then sort of all the things that, like, spring up from those industries, like, there's a lot of, huge law firms here that, deal with all those industries, so there's a lot going on here still.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good transition to pop culture as well, because I was just thinking about a lot of my favorite shows, actually, if I'm not mistaken, play in New York as well. Like the businesses you just mentioned, like advertisement, like Mad Men,
Yep.
like Lawyers, Suit, like
Yep.
all these shows I love are all centered in New York. And you already told us that you grew up around a lot of culture, and now obviously also a lot of diversity with the people, diversity in businesses, as we just established. Um, but where did that love for pop culture come from? What inspired that in you?
I think it's a mix of nature and nurture. So, my family really loves growing up. My parents are huge readers, have a huge library. Also, we went to the theater a lot. That's another thing that's centered in New York, like Broadway. We
Right.
went to a lot of Broadway. That was mostly actually my grandparents were really into both sets of grandparents loved the theater. So we did that a lot with them. And my dad listened to a lot of records. So it was all there for me, and my brother loves all that stuff. He did not become completely obsessed with it the way I did. And, the family joke is that I would just, kind of torture everyone in the car, even as a kid, by like wanting to, play a Bob Dylan album and, really talk about it and like analyze it in the car when everyone else just wanted to, drive. Or, like, even, like, a comic
Mm.
book that I had read and, give them a play-by-play summary of, like, "And then Archie said to Veronica," like, so I was given access to all of it and, everyone in my family appreciates it, but I think it just appealed to me on a nerdy level so it became my career. I just remember I'd watch a movie or listen to an album and just need to see it again and again and listen again and again. So that came from within, I think.
Right. Um, So yeah, let's talk about the novel. So before we get into too much what the novel specifically is about, I just really want to know. Obviously, you have a career in journalism, so writing wasn't something completely new to you. But how was that transition from someone who consumes books, who consumes music, and it's something you just love, to actually doing and creating it? You said it was a 7 years journey. So if you can take us to the beginning of that journey, how was all that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you do the skills that I took from journalism were being able to write a lot, to write quickly, to be clear. But to write
Mm,
a novel or any book, that's so many pages and so unwieldy, like you can't. I think it's almost hard to learn how to do it without trying to do it. So because
mm,
but that then in and of itself is a really long process. So I had gone to school. I had gone back to grad school to get a master's of fine arts in fiction writing, where I focused on short stories. And then I had my first child and was not writing much at all, focusing on my
mm,
job and my kid. And then around 2017, I just was restless and just sort of needed a creative outlet. So I had this idea to write this book years before that, but I never had done it. So I just was like, I'm going to just do this for fun. um,
mm,
I'm going to create an entire sort of fake musical history of this family and sort of see what happens. And I was really, I think that I was ready in a sense because I had read so many novels and because I had studied the art of fiction writing and because I had worked as a journalist and worked as a journalist online, which meant having to create just a huge amount of writing, right? When you work for an online
mm.
publication, you're just writing all the time, every day. So all that kind of helped me get a running start and write the draft relatively quickly. And then editing it, I think is where the real work happens and the challenge comes in and, trying to figure out with a book, so much of what you're trying to figure out, it's like the same thing as journalism, but on just a much bigger scale, which is like controlling what information gets released to the reader when, and making sure the reader is
Really?
learning enough to stay with you, but not so much that you want to keep them in suspense a little bit, also, right? So it's like, how much
Right.
do you let them know, and how much do you hold back, and pacing, and how do you keep readers' attention? Um, and so that, there was 2 years, I think, of revising it to that end and filling in blanks and character stuff. And then the next thing that happened for me was that I had a second kid. My husband had some health issues and COVID hit all kind of in the same
Mm,
year or two. So there was another long break where I wasn't working on it at all, really.
right.
And I really kind of was very sad about it. I missed the book, but the big advantage was that when I finally did come back to it, I had some good distance from it and I really kind of knew what has to be done. And so I took another year or so to revise it. And this time I changed the order around and I really got in and made some big changes and then I was an agent and then worked on it for a few more months with her. And then we sold it to an editor. And then I did another round of revision with her. And then, then there's copy editing with the publishing house and proofreading. So the publication process, just even the editorial part of it, is another year or so. And then you're just waiting for the book to come out for a while. So 7 years between kind of coming up with the idea and getting it published, and maybe like 3.5 to 4 of those years were actually actively working on it. And the other half was either kind of waiting
Right.
for life to calm down or waiting for edits to come back, um, Which and I think that those pauses are important too, right? Because yeah, they give you a chance to step away from the work and not be so emotionally invested, so that when it's time to come back, you can really work on it. But it is crazy process. Where I don't know any. I mean, there are some people who write a novel a year, but most people I know do take at least a few years between every book, because it is a long process, and you do need to.
Yeah. Um, I feel like because from what you said, it might be nice to have it over that long of a period because of that distance, like you said, and then you can look at it from a not as attached of a way. I always kind of imagined writing the novel being the hard part. But what you said also made a lot of sense. So how difficult is it actually? Well, either in writing or then I think in editing, you said is most of the work to hold back, to like think like the reader because you know your story, you know what you want to tell them, you're like probably eager to tell them, and how difficult is it to think in that reader mind and like pace these things?
It's hard. I think it's really hard because yeah, you do. Any writer will tell you that the story, and anyone who even I think who wants to write, that the story in your head sounds so great. And, it sounds perfect. And then, any attempt you get to put it you have to put it down on the page is just not gonna be as good. But you also have this idea in your head of how great it is and, complete it is. So trying to balance those things is difficult. And it's always important to have, people read it who aren't you for that reason. Although it has to be people who
Right.
really they have to be people that you really trust, who aren't gonna, say something that upsets you or messes up your process. So, for me, I was lucky that my husband was a great early reader, and so I had a few friends who also gave me great, very encouraging early reads. And so that's super important, I think. And then also to be able to do that yourself. And writers have all kinds of tricks to do this. So sometimes, like for me, it is printing the book out. I think I went to this copy shop near my kids' nursery school, so maybe 7 times to print the book out over the course of the whole process, and, each time during COVID in particular, I remember just going to the door, they didn't let people into the store, so I was, like, standing on the street outside the stationery, the copy shop, and I had a mask on, and the guy who ran it had a mask on, and I was, like, handing him the disc with the PDF that he was gonna print, and then he handed me the manuscript. And so reading it on paper, was a good trick for sort of being able to get distance. And some people will listen to it or read it out loud, or some people I know read it backwards, out of order. So they'll read the last chapter first and then kind of go back through the book. All to do that, what you just said, right? All to, get themselves out of their own head and into sort of a more neutral reader's head. But it's yeah, it can't you have to yeah, there's it's hard to do it just naturally. There has to be some kind of trick, I think.
I also feel like because obviously, like you said, there's people that have been doing it for years, that maybe do manage to get novel a year or something like that. And not speaking for those people, but maybe they kind of have a formula that they kind of follow because they know what works. But I feel like that's a huge difference between writing a novel and journalism because in journalism, I suppose again I don't know for sure, but I suppose there is more like rules and techniques. It's way more straightforward to write like a journalistic article than it might be to, or than I think it definitely is to write a novel because a novel can have so many different things that people can say, oh, this is great about the novel. And it's not really, at least in my head, or from formula that you follow to write a good and engaging novel.
I think that's true. I think so. I do think, right, if you're writing, and I love, by the way, I absolutely love genre fiction, like mysteries, romance novels, sci-fi, all that stuff. I think some of those books do have formulas. I mean, I know, for instance, for romance um, that there are actual like beat sheets that you can use, and I think for mysteries too that are like
Mm,
the meet cute, the big fight, the reconciliation, or with
right.
Mister the pairing, the first. And I think so. If you're writing in that in those forms, and you are more experienced, and you kind of have a few under your belt, and you also have time, then
Mm,
I think they're become more like journalism, actually, to write in those forms. And I think that because for journalism, right, there's like the profile, the celebrity profile, the news story, the op-ed. There are different forms that, that if you are, a newspaper reporter, maybe you're filing a story like that every couple of days. Um, and because you have a formula, it does make it easier to produce at that level. Certainly, yeah, when I used to write for these internet magazines, I was writing maybe 4 or 5 little essays a week about pop culture or politics,
mm,
um, I did, I did it's a muscle that you work. I was doing it so often that I got better and
yeah.
better at doing it quickly, and then but then there's the risk of burning out, which I think happened to a lot of people who were writing for the websites that were, there was that golden age of internet journalism. So that's sort of the flip side of it. Um, but it does feel like, writing at least for me still at this moment. And I know this is true for a lot of writers who've written and published their first book and are like thinking about writing another, and they sit down, and maybe even their third or fourth, and they sit down and they're like, wait a second, how do I do this? How did I do it
Mhm.
before? And how am I gonna do it again? This was, because it takes so long and you don't remember what it's like at the beginning of the process. So there are a lot of books out there that are trying to demystify it, even for those of us who have done it successfully once or twice. Um, because
Mm,
does feel like starting from scratch every time. And part of that is because, some really great a lot of really great writers out there are switching subject matter so drastically between from book to book. So they have to do a whole bunch of research and, get in a different mindset. So it can feel like starting all over again with their next book.
yeah. Um, so your novel specifically, you said you wanted to create basically a fake musical history. I think that's what you said earlier, in our talk. Um, so yeah, how exciting was that? Because you told us you love pop culture, you love music, and basically creating something in the world you love. Maybe how exciting, but also um, how difficult to do it justice. What was that idea?
That's a great question. It was so exciting. Some of my favorite I love works of art that do the same thing, that do, so, like, one that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the musical Dreamgirls. That's,
Mm,
based on, Diana Ross and the Supremes and their story, and Motown, but it's also completely made up. The characters are, while they're inspired by and based on, they because of the music, because the music is actually Broadway music and not Motown, and because the characters have taken on a life of their own, they are their own characters. Um, and there's the movie The Rose with, Bette Midler that's kind of based on Janis Joplin, and there's, this movie that I love called Velvet Goldmine. That's a Todd Haynes movie it's based on David Bowie and Iggy Pop and Lou Reed and glam rock in the '70s, but it's made up characters. So there's something that people like to do, I think, and it's a way of taking liberty with the truth of what really happened, but also paying homage to it. And so for me, it was so that aspect of it was by far the most fun and exciting part of writing it, was just like getting to go into these two historical eras, because the book takes place half in the 1960s in the Greenwich Village folk scene, and the other half is the 1990s with alternative rock, like Lilith Fair, kind of Alanis Morissette rock, then sort of moving into the pop star era. So like the end of one and the beginning of the other. So there's two musical eras that I love and I'm very interested in. And just getting to put my characters in there and sort of play around with the scenes that I knew so well was just really delightful and really fun. And I did worry about getting it right, and it was a huge relief to me. I was at a reading in Boston, and two women who were baby boomers told me that who had said they had hung out in the village in the 60s, said they thought I did a good job, just,
Really?
describing it. And they were sort of like, well, what did you do? Like, how did you capture it? And I was like, it's truly an example of both osmosis, that I like read so much about it and thought so much about it my whole life, that when it was time to write about it, I did have sort of all this knowledge like baked away, stored away in my brain. And then also just like so much love, that I think if you write about something with love and reverence and appreciation, it comes through to the reader, that you're fond of something. So even if you're not uncritical of it, even if you write about I wrote about the sexism and kind of some of the sillier aspects of that, like the sort of political hypocrisy of the folkies, but also admiration for their energy and their talent and their communal, their sense of community. Um, so I think that sort of carried through, and it was really just a joy, the most joyful part to write about, because there's other stuff in the book that was more painful, the family dynamics and the fights and the secrets that propel the plot were also enjoyable to write, but more painful were the vignettes and the pop culture and the parties where people are playing music were just very fun to write.
So obviously, music being a big theme of the book, and basically you creating something new, I can imagine that there's also songs in the book
Hmm.
that aren't real songs. Um, so that's a whole nother thing, because we just talked about how to write a novel for the first time, but writing lyrics
Hmm.
um, is, and I would just suppose something you don't do in your journalistic
No.
daily life. So how was all that? How was creating lyrics?
Gosh, I loved the lyrics. And the lyrics, really, a lot of them, not all of them. Some I wrote at the very, very end, but I would say like 80% of them were written during the first two or three drafts of the book. So that was like
Mm,
very much part of my original vision, that there would be lyrics in the book that carried the plot forward and expressed the relationships between the characters, because that was what I wanted the book to be all about, was a family who used songs and used lyrics to communicate with each other, um, and
mm,
and tell their own story. So so I wrote them really just as I was drafting the book. I would be like, oh, and then she came up with this idea for this song, and I'm gonna just scribble down some lyrics, and I refined them. Um,
mm.
I don't mean to say anything negative about lyricists, because I think lyricists are the best, but for me it was like very fun, because I did seriously study poetry in college, but I was never going to be a real poet. So it was like a chance to write bad poetry that sounded good as lyrics. And it was so fun, and I think I don't know what it's like now to be a young person listening to music digitally, but so much of how previous generations accessed music was to get a CD or a record or even a cassette tape, and you open up the the package, you put the music on and you have the lyrics in front of you in a booklet, right,
Mm.
like, from the CD, and you sit and you read the lyrics while you're listening to the music, and that's part of how you first experience any new album. At least that was how it was for us when we bought music physically. So I bought all my music on cassette tapes or CDs, and now, my husband and I will buy things on vinyl again, but, and so I think that actually was probably more than studying formal poetry. What inspired the writing of the lyrics was having studied so many lyric booklets so seriously as a teenager and a 20-something. But by the time I was a 20-something, we were already listening to MP3s. So it was really those teenage years when I was still buying CDs that had that influence.
Kind of want to take that to ask a little bit of an off-topic question, but um, I also experienced, and I still bought CDs as well when I was like very young. But especially my parents, they
Mhm.
had like they had a whole collection of CDs. They also had vinyls, but we didn't really listen to them anymore because they didn't have a player anymore when I was growing up.
Mhm.
But we still saw the collection, and um, N not 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 wanting to put on any value on it, obviously, but do you feel like the appreciation for music has changed through the kind of medium that we consume the music? Doesn't need to be worse or better, but did it just maybe change in some way?
I think so. Probably there are people out there who have more sophisticated answers. I certainly think that there's more emphasis now on individual songs. And it only art a lot of artists who are really at the top of their game who are making albums. Albums have to be good enough to from sort of start to end to break through and appeal to people as an album. Whereas in the I think
Mm,
older times you would just you if you liked a couple of singles from an artist that you heard on the radio, you would go out and buy the whole album and listen to the whole album. And now you don't have you could just listen to the
mm.
single over and over again if that's what you like. So you have to know that the album is really good to invest in it. So that that's different. And yeah, this is true. I think with not just music, but with a lot of the way we consume media now, is you can kind of just jump from one thing to another without having to make as much of an investment in it. So the cool part of it is that you are getting exposed to a lot more that you might not be exposed to otherwise. But the difficult part is that you're not necessarily sitting with and wrestling with art the way you might have before. Because if you don't like it or it doesn't appeal to you right away, you can just listen to the next thing, listen to the next song, or watch the next show, and that means that maybe you're not experiencing things that were, like, difficult to get into or challenging at first to you, but then you really end up liking, which I think is a great way to experience things.
I also feel like that abundance maybe took away a little bit of the curiosity and the excitement because like you said, it's not like I could just go on the streaming platform and just sample or just quickly see, oh, do I like the sound of this album? But you had to physically buy it. So you're like, oh, there's a new Pink Floyd album. And I want to get the album before even knowing what is going to be on the album. You had
Right.
to invest because of what the band is, or because of who the singer, who the songwriter is. And nowadays, yeah, there's just so much readily available. The same with media as well,
Mhm.
probably.
Mhm.
'Cause it's like, oh, I like this newspaper. I'm getting this newspaper, and you invested in kind of the brand rather than maybe the actual content. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but there was
Exactly.
more of an emphasis on the creator itself.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, but it's still possible to experience things that way, but I think it's just a bit harder to get through to it. That makes sense.
So I wanted to ask more about the kinds of music as well, because as I just shared, my parents had a lot of CDs and we
Mhm.
listened to a lot of music, actually of the 90s. There was a lot of the music
Mm.
that they liked, that they know. So it's music that I am very familiar with as well. What I'm not very familiar with is the music of the 60s, the folk. Wh- what was it about that culture, and what would you say were like main aspects of that music that make it interesting to you? You think make it interesting to an audience? What is it about that time of music and maybe also so music creation?
Yeah, it was just an incredibly fertile time for music, and I think, like, a lot of what we listen to now in the '90s and today, even like Taylor Swift, and the other sort of singer-songwriters who are such huge pop stars now, all kind of began at that moment because what was happening was, the idea of folk music is it comes from the people and, from all around America, but, this folk scene in the '60s took that idea of just you just need to be a person with a guitar and turn it into,
Mm,
like, introspective, like, lyric-focused, popular music. So, a lot of it was very political at first, civil rights, Vietnam, um,
mm,
writing about social injustice, and then it evolved and became very personal and introspective. So, like, if you think about Joni Mitchell as sort of the kind of pinnacle
right.
of that, like, writing these incredibly poetic, like, really dense, difficult, like, wonderful masterpieces, or like Leonard Cohen about their own lives that and Bob Dylan, where they're, like, talking about themselves and also the Bible and also politics, um, and and in these really sophisticated ways that are also really popular. So it turned, and we're this Bob Dylan movie that everyone is talking about. I think that movie is trying to show is the way he transformed in that moment in time, transformed music into kind of or popular music into high art. And the Beatles were doing this too, right? And Motown also. Like, there was
Right.
all happening in the '60s at the same time in different areas, right? In like England and in Detroit, and then with Dylan in New York City, where all of a sudden music is just becoming like a really, really amazing, sophisticated, like genius level output, which we see again in the '90s, like Nirvana um, and hip hop and all the stuff that happened in the '90s, and then we're seeing again now. Like, I was just talking with my colleague about how amazing pop music has been the last year. So that's when it all started in the '60s, and when people, I think, find very appealing about the Greenwich Village folk scene was that there were so many talented people in this very small, speaking of, like, the allure and myth of New York City, right? The small part of New York City where, the buildings aren't high and it's very quaint and very old, and everyone's going to a few different clubs and bumping into each other, these famous musicians, and learning from each other and getting inspired by each other, and then going out and making music that was really gonna change the world, or at least change the world, maybe not change the world politically, but change the world in terms of pop culture. So, um, it's it's a well that people really are still going back to think about it. It kind of the way I compare it would be to, like, other moments like the Renaissance in Italy, or like the Romantic poets in England and Germany and Europe, right? Like, these sort of eras in culture that, like, washed away what came before them and change things going forward. So, like, I think that, the music of the '60s has that quality to it.
Um, that's always kind of a cool thing, if we look back. And I'm just gonna say for me personally, because I don't want to generalize, but that's what I like about classic literature, for example. For me, like I said, I'm a huge fan of literature, and I like how these classic novels basically are timeless and have ideas and messages that to this day you can read. books. Yeah, I don't want to mention specific ones, but for example, 1984,
Mhm,
it's
mhm.
still so relevant.
Yeah.
Like there's books that have been written, um, and they're they're going to be relevant for a long time. And with what you just mentioned in music, and that time there, do you think that uh, because that's a question I always ponder, except for literature, for other arts.
Mhm.
Do you think we will ever have a time again where we see something similar, where we have a similar, obviously in a different way, but in the sense of we are just creating something that will influence for another decade, another decades, the art, because right now, like you said, it's all influenced by that, but it's not really changing a lot. I see.
Yeah, I do think I mean, that's part of what my book is actually about because the book is literally a story about the children of baby boomers, and the parents lived in the '60s and lived through the '60s and contributed to that culture change, and I think the daughter, my character Emma, has a kind of anger that maybe is hard to understand, and part of it is she knows that she can't surpass what her parents and her aunt did with their generation, right? That
Right.
she's still all her friends still think about her parents' music as being really important, and she wants to make her own way and make a name for herself, and she's sort of still in the shadow of not just her parents, but their whole generation. So I mean, they're very unique characters, but you could also say there's kind of a metaphor there for, like how everyone making art in the shadow of what the baby boomers did, particularly with music, feel. Um, but I think it will happen. I think unfortunately, things are as global events are kind of rough and people have hard times, that does create interesting art. I was just talking to friends about like Hollywood movies in the 1930s that we love so much. And that was all during the Depression. That was all, being made to comment on the Great Depression here, where people were hungry and miserable and sad, and to cheer people up and to, so hard times do eventually create interesting art, and there's always room for a new generation to change things. So I think it will happen, but we're still at this moment, we're still maybe at the tail end of the influence of the '60s for sure. Yeah, we haven't remade things quite yet entirely.
Another thing I always wonder, and again, I'm just putting my personal thoughts out there. I don't know if they are true or make any sense. But I feel like in general and what is popular in the mainstream, we're going more and more away from like raw raw music. So you mentioned Bob Dylan, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Bob Dylan who did Masters of War,
Mhm.
which is like a
Mhm.
great song. And
Mhm.
um so uh, I'm just wondering if with the way we are creating music right now, with a lot of uh special effects, a lot of like auto-tune, stuff like that.
Right, high
You think
production values. Yeah.
is it possible to create music like that anymore?
I do think so. But I think it's maybe harder to break through. But I mean, my husband, is like very much he writes about music for a living and edits. So some of my exposure to all the stuff comes from him, and he's still going to like, we live in New York City, he's going to little clubs and seeing new bands that are doing interesting and raw things. And so I think it's out there, but I do think that what you were just talking about before is the abundance thing of, and this is true with literature too. Like there's so much out there, and there's a little bit of an echo
Mm,
chamber where like everyone's listening to the same things, and it's hard to wade through all the other things that are out there with both books and even with like television where you're like, there are 55 different streaming services and you're like, which
Right.
one do I do? It's harder to find the stuff that feels fresh and original and new because you're bombarded, you're overloaded. But also at the same time, it's everyone's picking the same 10 albums as their top albums of the year. So it's more I think it's more challenging. So I don't know, um, I think it's above my pay grade to know, like, whether someone like Dylan could like, what would happen now, but I mean, there are a lot of really genius musicians out there working, so one has to hope that they would find their way. I mean, Taylor Swift, is a generational talent, um,
Right.
I think, for sure, as a songwriter. Um, but no, she's not writing Masters of War. But then neither was Bob Dylan after a while. He got tired of writing protest music, so
No, it's also like you said, it was just probably the times,
Mhm.
in which he wrote that song. It's like
Yep.
it just
Yeah,
inspired it and just
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you can feel the anger that, in that song, like, they're just raw, like, youthful. You're right about anger. That has to it works because it's so authentic. There's a great cover. I love Eddie Vedder, I think, and Pearl Jam did a really good cover of that song,
mm,
that I think, worked also well because Eddie was angry too. He really felt it.
that's funny because I actually heard that cover, for the first
First,
time here
yeah.
in New Zealand, when a friend of mine showed it to me from Australia, and he
Mhm.
was like, "You need to listen to the Eddie Vedder
Yeah,
version,"
yeah.
and it is a great cover.
Yeah, it is, it is.
Um, so maybe a question that I didn't ask, like that before, but we already touched on, what like, we touched a little bit about what you wanted to write about in the novel, but what would you say were the main ideas why you wrote the book? So people that read the book, what would you want them to I mean, obviously without spoiling anything, of the plot, but what would you want them to take away from reading your book?
So, I think, right, we talked about some of the sort of the musical and artistic theme, but I think, a big question the book asks is, like a bigger question, a deeper question is sort of the question. So everyone in the book is an artist. They all kind of have different artistic personalities and temperaments, right? Some decide to devote their whole life to being on stage and communing with their audience, and others kind of go back and forth and have more of a complicated relationship with that. But and the book sort of asks, is there a right way to do this? And also how important is it to make sure your personal relationships and your family relationships and your friendships are right compared to making your art. So and it doesn't have to be, the message doesn't have to be just about making art. Like I was talking to friends about um people who do social justice work and like charity work and how that can you feel like so many people are depending on you and that can take you away from your friends and family. And so that question of balance between like doing something great and making the world, changing the world versus your intimate circle of friends and family is a question I think actually most of us face at some point, right? Or think about, which is more important. And and my characters have different approaches to it, and the novel asks the question but doesn't answer kind of what matters more because the main character, one of the two main characters, Judy, is this really, really talented songwriter um, who everyone kind of wants to keep. They want to keep her to keep working and being on stage, and she takes a long hiatus from performing, and she's still writing some songs, but she's also working to do some repair work with her family, with some mistakes that she's made, and she really wants to make things right. So the characters ask directly themselves kind of like, well, should she have should she be aware of us, or should she have been actually there on stage and giving the world more of her amazing music? We're like, should I like her kids are like, should I have been born? Like, did we take her away from her art? But she feels very proud of her kids and her, even though she's a very imperfect, not a great mom. But she at the end of the book, she feels very proud of them. Those kinds of big questions, um, about, friendship and family versus a larger calling, I think are sort of the deeper themes of the book. And then it's also about, generation influence one generation to another, and like growing in your parents' shadow, trying to become your own person. And then sort of the final thing that I'll say it's also about being a woman. And there are important male characters, but the two main characters are a mother and a daughter. And it's about being a woman and kind of a male at the time. Both the 60s and the 90s were pretty male dominated times in music. And trying to really authentically express yourself and be the artist or the person that you really want, kind of being held back, not just by sexism and, patriarchy and like sexist music labels, but also by your own conceptions about what you're supposed to be as a woman. Whether, are you supposed
Mm.
to be nice or obliging and not cause trouble, but also really wanting to cause trouble with your music. So that conflict
Right.
is another conflict, and it's kind of related. They're all, all the themes are related to each other. Um, but what I love about the book still, even having now like been on tour with it for a while, and talking about it, that it's got these heavier themes, but it's in a fun pop culture secrets and mysteries package. So it's an enjoyable read, but hopefully that one that will also leave you thinking a little bit at the end, which is kind of my perfect read for myself, like what I would want to choose to read myself. So that was why it was fun to write. Yeah, because it is the kind of book I would like to read.
Those were really good themes. Like, those are important questions, and questions that I feel like every generation kind of asks themselves. So, and obviously are also big questions in art. So it's a great thing to combine that with the music field. And yeah, so that really sounds interesting. Let me ask you lastly, I always want to know about what's happening in someone's life at the moment. What is something you do at the moment? You said you touring with the book.
Mhm.
Any aspirations, any goals that you're working towards currently?
It's a great question. Well, because it's going to sound so pedestrian, but I have a lot of things in my life that I put off until after the book got published. So, like dealing with things in my apartment, and
Mm,
would be was a big one. And also maybe going back to this I haven't done yet, but going back to doing some journalistic writing, which I have done very little of in the last few years because I've been focused on the novel. So there's a lot of stuff that I've said that I wanted to. I'll deal with that when the book is done, and then I'm starting to deal with. So like we have a new fridge, and I gave away all the kids,
mm,
the baby toys, and it feels really good actually to be taken care of. And it's funny because that's what the book is also about, is like the conflict between making art and like also just taking care of your daily life, and how it's sometimes hard to do both. So at this
yeah.
very moment, I am still doing book events and talking about the book, and I am trying to write another book. But I would say that my 2025 goals are kind of to slowly start writing another book, but also to spend a little time enjoying the the good parts of the daily grind. Which is to say, like, making my home nicer and doing some things. Like I really want to teach my kids how to ride a bike and swim this year. They're both really close
Mm.
to doing both, but they're both I have stubborn the younger one will learn easily. The older one is very stubborn about he'll learn something new easily if he wants to do it. Like he loves skiing and skating, so he'll do it. He'll do that, and he'll
Nice.
take instruction really well. But if he's not that interested, he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to do it. So getting him on board in some of these activities, so that my younger one can then also do it because he likes to do what his brother does. So just little things like
Mm.
that. Like if I can end the year with my child riding a bike, and a new bed for the little one, and a new novel in progress, that will be an amazing year for me. Small goals.
No, like you said, sometimes that's what life is about, right? It's the small
Exactly.
things.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. Well, Sarah, I really loved our talk. It was very inspiring for me to hear your whole journey and basically you taking us behind what inspired the book and how it was for you to go through all those steps. Um, so, yeah, if you just want to tell us once more, and I'll put all the links in the description as well so people can easily find it. But where can we find the book? Where can we find out more about you? What's your online presence?
I'm on all the websites. It's my website is Sarah with an H, M Seltzer, like seltzer water or Alka Seltzer.com. And my handle on everything from TikTok to Blue Sky to Instagram is Sarah with an H M Seltzer. And I'm on all like um so at this moment there's no I was a big Twitter user in the heyday of Twitter, but I'm no longer really using it. So I'm still kind of figuring out what my next favorite social media site will be. But I think it's mostly Instagram for the moment. But yeah, and then if you just Google or use your any other web browser to look up the Singer Sisters novel, it is available in a lot of places because I have a British, UK, and British territories publisher, and there's an Australian publisher, and so it's available in English language bookstores
Oh,
in Europe, um, and in New Zealand and Australia and places like that too, as well as in North America.
cool.
Yeah,
All right. So, yeah, Sarah, thank you so much for your
this
time.
was so
Thank you
lovely.
for sharing it.
Yeah, this was really great. Very relaxing. You asked really good questions.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It
Yeah,
was really nice.
great. Well, enjoy the rest of your I don't know, what time of day is it where you are?
It's 11 a.m.
Amazing.
here
So
in New
enjoy the
Zealand.
rest of your day in New Zealand.
You have a
You
nice
can see
evening as well.
the sun just set here.
Yeah,
All
I've seen that happening.
right. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.